What's happening is that a familiar world led, so-called, by the United States and Europe is no longer led by the United States and Europe. It was presumptuous to be led by the United States and Europe to begin with. The real worry I have is just disaster in the short term, because my country is the worst led that it's ever been, and our political system has collapsed. Honestly, it doesn't get dumber than this, really.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to help you cut through the noise, transforming complex global events into, well, crystal clear insights.
That's right. We go through the articles, the research, the commentary, so you get the core knowledge you need.
And today, we're plunging into a really critical moment, very interconnected. President Trump's recent decision launching strikes against 3 nuclear sites in Iran.
Right.
And how that ties into these incredibly sharp criticisms of his economic and foreign policies from Jeffrey Sachs, renowned economist.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is exactly that connection. We want to pull out the key insights from, our stack of sources here.
Right.
Really revealing Sachs's explosive critiques. I mean, he called Trump's tariff policy crazy, childish, and dangerous.
Wow.
And then there's that unforgettable line, very provocative, suggesting Mickey Mouse is smarter.
I remember reading that one.
Yeah. So we'll connect those economic views directly to what happened right after the Iran strikes. We'll unpack the potential economic costs.
Which could be huge, right?
Huge. Sachs estimates up to $10 trillion globally. Astonishing figure.
10 trillion.
Plus the diplomatic fallout, the geopolitical risks, which are incredibly complex, and, what might happen next for the region, for the world.
And understanding these connections, these dynamics, it's absolutely crucial if you're interested in U.S. Middle East politics, global economic impacts.
For sure.
This isn't just headlines. It's about connecting those dots, finding surprising facts, maybe unexpected connections, get you that really nuanced perspective. So buckle up. Let's unpack this.
Jeffrey Sachs's blistering critique of Trump's economic policies.
All right, so let's kick things off by really digging into Jeffrey Sachs's assessment of Trump's economic policies, especially trade and tariffs.
Yeah.
He really doesn't hold back, does he? I mean, his main argument is pretty blunt. He claims Trump's understanding of trade is so flawed,
Fundamentally flawed,
that he wouldn't pass a basic economics class. That's quite a statement from someone like Sachs.
It really is. And he elaborates quite carefully on why he thinks that, especially about trade deficits.
Right. The idea that the U.S. is being cheated.
Exactly. Trump suggested that a lot, other countries cheating, manipulating things. But Sachs makes it very clear. In his view, a trade deficit just means the United States spends more than it earned. Period.
Okay. So it's not about cheating.
Not according to Sachs. He uses this great analogy, actually. It's simple but sharp.
What's that?
He compares it to someone buying stuff on a credit card, racking up debt,
Right.
and then turning around and accusing the shop of cheating them.
Okay, I see the point.
Yeah, and this is crucial because Sachs says the real issue behind the deficit is excessive U.S. government spending.
So internal U.S. policy, not foreign trade practices.
Precisely, not, nefarious actions by other countries. He frames it as a basic macroeconomic identity. If a country invests more than its size domestically,
It needs money from elsewhere.
exactly, it has to import capital from abroad. And that shows up as a trade deficit. It's a symptom of how we manage our own finances, basically, not external exploitation.
And then he gets into the specifics of how these tariffs were put in place. He called it a stupid formula.
Yeah, a stupid formula, apparently crafted literally overnight by the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Why? Because, as Sachs put it, the boss wants it.
Wow. Just like that.
Seems so. And what really shows the, lack of rigor, what Sachs calls an utterly senseless approach, is that this formula was just slapped onto everyone, even tiny countries like Lesotho. Yeah. Think about it. A country like Lesotho, small economy, specific ties, specific exports, applying some generic tariff designed without any real analysis.
The impact could be huge for them, disproportionate.
Exactly. It just paints this picture of policy being made up on the fly, no real thought to the consequences, or, frankly, basic economics.
So not just the theory was wrong, in Sachs's view, but the execution was chaotic.
Right. And he doesn't stop there. He also just dismisses the whole idea of tariffs as a major revenue source or, some magic bullet for the budget.
The idea of replacing income tax with tariffs, for instance.
He calls that idea fatuous. Utterly foolish is what that means.
Okay, well, why fatuous?
Well, look at the numbers. The U.S. budget deficit, it's hovering around, 7% of GDP? That's a big hole.
Right, huge.
Tariffs, even if you apply them really broadly, maybe they collect 1% of GDP.
So 1% versus 7%. Not even close.
Not even in the same ballpark. It's a massive mismatch. They could never cover the government's spending shortfall.
And trying to get even that 1% would cause problems.
He warns it would be very disruptive indeed. Very disruptive to the whole economy.
How so? Give me an example.
Okay, think about an American car maker. They
Yeah.
need microchips, right? Maybe sourced from Asia.
Sure. Critical components.
Slap a tariff on those chips.
Yeah.
The cost jumps. Who pays? Not the foreign producer, ultimately.
It gets passed down
Right down the supply chain. To the car maker, then to the dealership, then...
to the person buying the car.
Exactly. It raises prices for consumers. It fuels inflation. It stifles economic activity. It's a ripple effect.
And Sachs pointed this out directly, didn't he? The impact on American consumers.
Oh, absolutely. He said tariffs would raise substantially consumer costs for many different areas of the economy.
So not just theory, but hitting people's wallets.
Directly. And you saw the administration constantly having to react, didn't you? Trump often had to postpone or eliminated or offset or gave an exemption.
Right, for different sectors that push back. Farming, maybe?
But-
Some manufacturing?
Exactly. Certain agricultural products, specific goods, this constant shifting, this backtracking.
What did Sachs make of that?
He argued it just proved the policy wasn't thought out properly in the first place.
Right, kind of reactive.
And that it clearly lacked broad support, not from the public, not from businesses, maybe not even the industries it was supposed to help. It looked like policy being improvised in real time, often just reacting to political heat.
Which leads us to that really memorable analogy he used, the Mickey Mouse one.
Oh, yeah. That one definitely got attention.
He said, "This used to be not a Mickey Mouse country, my country. But this is Mickey Mouse." And then he apologized to Mickey Mouse.
Mickey Mouse is smarter than this.
Yeah.
It's designed to be jarring, obviously.
So what's the deeper meaning there, according to Sachs?
Well, when he unpacks it, he's really emphasizing his view that these policies weren't driven by sound economics at all. They were driven by electoral criteria.
Politics, basically. Trying to win votes.
Exactly. He argues Trump was selling a pseudo-explanation and a pseudo-remedy.
A fake explanation and a fake solution.
Pretty much. Aimed directly at swing states like Michigan and Ohio, places where manufacturing job loss has been a huge issue for decades.
And the explanation Trump offered was?
Blaming other countries, China, Mexico, unfair trade, stealing jobs. That narrative.
But Sachs disagrees.
Strongly. He contends the true cause of those job losses in the Midwest isn't trade, it's automation.
Automation, technology replacing workers.
Yes. He uses the example of modern car plants. Go inside one, he says. They're all robots.
Powerful image.
It is, so those jobs didn't just go overseas. Many were eliminated by technology, right here in the US.
Which completely reframes the problem.
Completely. It shifts the focus from, external enemies to internal technological change. And that needs totally different policy solutions than tariffs.
That's fascinating. And he connects this economic approach to something even bigger, doesn't he? A concern about governance.
Yeah, he does. He sees the U.S. edging toward authoritarianism.
Strong words.
Very. Characterized by what he calls one-man rule by emergency decree.
And the tariffs are an example of that.
Precisely. Remember how they were implemented? By executive decree.
Not through Congress, through legislation and debate.
Right. And Sachs argues that approach creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty and instability, not just economically, but in the system of governance itself.
So it's a warning about eroding checks and balances, presidential power bypassing the legislative branch.
That seems to be exactly his concern. Major policies decided without that traditional process.
Wow. And then he broadens the scope even further, talking about the U.S. place in the world psychologically.
Yeah, this is really interesting. He thinks the U.S. political system is basically shocked by the rise of other global powers, China, India.
And struggling with losing that top spot.
Struggling with the psychological blow of not alone at the perch on top. I mean, think about it. After World War II, the U.S. was the undisputed number one. A unique position now. It's different. And Sachs sees a kind of national identity crisis playing out because of that.
How does that connect to Trump?
Well, Sachs even cites that that very direct, frankly vulgar quote from Trump. We should attribute it carefully. Countries are lining up to kiss my ass.
Right, I remember that quote.
Sachs uses that as a stark example of this mindset, this perceived need for dominance, for total deference from everyone else.
Which Sachs sees as out of touch.
Increasingly out of touch with global reality, and leading to policies that reflect this internal struggle, maybe, rather than strategic thinking.
Okay, let's shift to the economic costs, that number you mentioned earlier. $10 trillion.
Yeah, a staggering figure. Sachs attributes a $10 trillion loss in global wealth directly to Trump's economic strategies.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around that number. How does he even calculate something like that? What's the mechanism?
It is immense, and he gives, compelling reasons for it. He says flat out, the U.S. will be the #1 loser from these policies.
The U.S. itself. Why?
Because, in his analysis, they're isolating the U.S. economy, fundamentally.
How does isolation hurt?
Well, it makes U.S. goods and services more expensive overseas, right? So it's raising the prices of U.S. goods.
Okay.
Which then makes U.S. manufacturing less efficient in a global market, less competitive.
Makes sense.
And he details all these intricate ways the U.S. depends on global partners. We rely on China, for example, not just for cheap stuff at Walmart.
Like components too.
Yeah.
Supply chains.
Vital components in complex supply chains. Critical rare earth minerals for tech. And crucially,
What else?
China buying U.S. Treasury notes. Loads of them.
Which funds our deficit spending.
Exactly. It's absolutely essential for funding America's huge budget deficit. And Sachs argues all these connections, goods, supply chains, minerals, finance, they're all being deeply dislocated by these policies.
Leading to?
Lost trade, less foreign investment in the U.S., market instability, slower global growth potential overall. It's not just a minor bump, it's a systemic shock. Huge negative consequences for the U.S. economy itself and its global standing. That's how you start getting towards that $10 trillion figure.
It really underlines that core economic idea that, according to Sachs, Trump just doesn't get.
Which is?
That there are no winners in trade wars.
Right. Trade fundamentally is mutually beneficial. It's a positive-sum game. Cooperation can make everyone better off.
But Trump sees it differently.
Sachs says Trump thinks in terms of win-lose, a zero-sum game. My gain has to be your loss.
And that mindset, Sachs suggests, is a recipe for
mutual destruction, not mutual benefit.
So how is the rest of the world reacting to this America First economic approach? Are they just accepting it?
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, as Sachs does, this isolationist stance is causing a major global reaction.
Okay, like what?
He observes countries are actively looking away from the U.S., seeking new deals, new pathways that bypass American influence.
Examples.
Well, Canada is reportedly planning with the EU to work around the U.S., strengthening ties across the Atlantic, independent of Washington.
Interesting.
And China, reportedly planning a trade economy that specifically excludes the U.S., building its own network centered on Asia.
Wow. So really moving away.
It's a profound shift. It demonstrates, as Sachs puts it, that the rest of the world can survive without our dollars.
Which raises a big question.
Yeah.
If the U.S. keeps going down this unilateral path, what does that mean for global stability? For cooperation?
It suggests potentially a rapid erosion of U.S. influence, not just economically, but politically, diplomatically.
Right.
A fundamental reordering of global power.
And Sachs's critique of U.S. unilateralism goes way beyond just tariffs.
Well, yeah, much broader. He asserts the U.S. is the least aligned nation with the United Nations-based multilateral system.
Least aligned. That's strong.
And that, far from being a force for good, the U.S. is actively weakening international peace and development. It's a sweeping condemnation of America's global role. Like it's dismantling the very system it helped build.
Does he give specific examples of this beyond trade?
He does. He talks about what he calls economic bullying.
Okay. What does that include?
It's not just tariffs. It's a wide array of unilateral coercive measures. Things like sanctions on individuals, on entire banks.
We hear about those a lot.
And even the confiscation of state assets. He mentions Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Afghanistan.
And his issue with these is?
His condemnation is really strong here. He argues these measures deprive people of access to food, water, and healthcare.
So a direct humanitarian impact.
Which raise mortality rates. While the U.S. might justify them, for foreign policy goals, combating terror, promoting rights,
sure,
Sachs says the impact on ordinary people is devastating. And furthermore, he argues these actions are not only illegal under the UN Charter, but also morally indefensible.
Wow. illegal and morally indefensible.
He paints a picture of economic tools being wielded with brutal consequences, often hitting innocent civilians, not just the regimes.
He also brings up the World Trade Organization, right? The WTO.
Yes, another critical example of this unilateralism, the U.S. blocking appointments to the WTO's appellate body since 2019.
Explain that for people listening. Why does that matter?
The appellate body is basically the WTO's Supreme Court for trade disputes. The final word when countries disagree.
Okay.
By blocking appointments, the U.S. has effectively paralyzed it. It can't hear cases, it prevents settlements. It means, as Sachs says, that crucial rules-based institution cannot do its job.
So undermining the very system meant to handle trade disputes peacefully.
Exactly. Not just ignoring rulings, but breaking the mechanism itself. A mechanism the U.S. historically championed.
And it's not just economic unilateralism, is it? He talks with the military side, too.
Absolutely. He brings in this profound concern about the sheer scale of the U.S. military presence globally.
The bases.
Yeah. He states very starkly, no other country comes close to the U.S. situation of 750 overseas military bases in 80 countries.
750 bases.
He argues this huge footprint isn't just costly, it's highly detrimental to American security and a threat to global peace.
How so? Detrimental to U.S. security.
Because it often creates resentment, he argues. It can foster proxy conflicts, draw the U.S. into interventions unnecessarily.
And then there's the withdrawal from treaties.
Right. He points to the U.S. pulling out of key arms control treaties, like the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF, and the Open Skies Treaty.
What's the impact of leaving those?
Sachs contends it heightens tensions, makes things more dangerous, and it wastefully diverts resources away from domestic needs or real international cooperation.
So it connects back to the economic side, too, in a way. Wasted resources.
Exactly. It broadens his critique. It's a holistic view. U.S. unilateralism, economic and military, is actively destabilizing the world order, in his view.
The Iran strikes constitutional clash and geopolitical fallout.
Okay, let's shift gears now. From those broader critiques, let's zoom into the immediate dramatic events. The Iran strikes.
The recent ones.
It was Saturday, June 21st, 2025. President Trump announces he had ordered strikes targeting Iran's Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan nuclear sites.
Key sites in their program.
And he later said all the American planes successfully departed Iranian airspace and were safely on their way home.
It's worth noting these strikes reportedly used bunker buster bombs, the GBU-57 MOPs, massive ordnance penetrators.
Bunker busters, they sound serious.
They are incredibly powerful, incredibly expensive, something like $500 million each.
$500 million per bomb.
That's the reported cost, which immediately raises questions, about resource allocation.
And did they work? Was it a complete success?
Well, the official line was success. But there were initial reports, some doubts, about whether they could fully destroy really hardened, deeply buried targets, like Fordo, which is built inside a mountain.
Right. Famously hard to hit.
So critics argued even these huge bombs might just set Iran's program back temporarily, not eliminate it. A very high price tag for maybe an incomplete result.
And the reaction back in the U.S., it wasn't universal praise, was it?
Not at all. Almost immediately. Even as some lawmakers did commend the move as decisive.
You got an immediate wave of fuming responses from others, a clear split right away.
Yeah, fuming's a good word for some of it.
And that concern quickly ramped up into actual calls for impeachment from Democrats.
Yes. Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, was very vocal.
What did she say?
She called Trump's decision a grave violation of the Constitution and congressional war powers.
Grave violation. Strong language.
She argued he impulsively risked launching a war that may ensnare us for generations. And stated flatly, it's absolutely and clearly grounds for impeachment.
That's about as serious as it gets, challenging his authority as commander-in-chief.
And others echoed those constitutional concerns, really focusing on the separation of powers.
Who else?
Thomas Massey, a Republican, often libertarian leaning on these things.
Right.
He just said, this is not constitutional. Simple as that. And Senator Bernie Sanders called the strikes grossly unconstitutional. He laid out that core principle. The only entity that can take this country to war is the U.S. Congress. The president does not have the right.
So it highlights that fundamental disagreement, president's role versus Congress's war powers.
Exactly. A debate that's been around for decades, but gets incredibly sharp with unilateral military action like this. The concern isn't just this strike, it's the precedent it sets for executive power.
There was also a lot of anger about Congress not being told beforehand.
Huge frustration over the lack of advance notice. Jim Himes, top Democrat on the Intel Committee, he fumed on X, saying his attention to these things comes before bombs fall, full stop.
Before, not after.
That's the principle. Congress, as the body that declares war, should be consulted prior to action, not just briefed afterwards.
And the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries.
He demanded the administration explain why this military action was undertaken, insisted Congress must be fully and immediately briefed.
And he placed the blame squarely on Trump.
Yes, asserted that Donald Trump shoulders complete and total responsibility for any adverse consequences, pushing accountability right to the executive.
It sounds like deep frustration with being bypassed, though some leaders were notified, weren't they?
Reportedly, yes. Some top Republicans, like Speaker Mike Johnson, were given advance notice. But the issue for many was when and how Congress as a whole was informed, or rather, not informed.
Okay, but there were counter-arguments, right, defending the president's authority.
Absolutely. It's crucial to hear those too. They draw on history, legal interpretations.
Like who? What did they say?
Legal scholar Jonathan Turley, he stressed that other presidents have engaged in similar strikes abroad, both parties, without formal war declarations.
So precedent exists.
He suggested critics would have to argue it meets the constitutional bar of a high crime and misdemeanor for impeachment, which is very high.
And politically. Any defenders?
Oh yes, Rep. Mike Lawler, a Republican, openly supported the decision. He drew parallels to President Obama's actions. Obama's extensive use of drone strikes, military actions in Libya, Syria, Pakistan, Yemen. Lawler argued those were done under the broad 2001 and 2002 AUMF.
The authorization for use of military force from after 9/11.
Exactly, which successive presidents have interpreted very broadly to allow action against vaguely defined threats, often without new votes from Congress.
Controversially interpreted, some would say.
Very controversially. Lawler also said, war has not been declared, however, a nuclear Iran has been prevented. Basically arguing mission accomplished, no full war started within presidential powers.
A preventative measure.
That's the justification.
Now here's where, for me, it gets really interesting, maybe surprising.
The split within the Manji base.
Exactly. Not just Democrats versus Republicans, but a split inside Trump's own Make America Great Again movement.
Yeah, that was significant.
It highlights this real tension, doesn't it, between his campaign rhetoric, no more forever wars, and this action.
A core promise versus a military strike. It definitely wasn't a unified response, even from his big supporters.
Tell me about the opposition from within MAGA.
Well, it was pretty stark from some key figures. Steve Bannon.
Former chief strategist.
Right. Architect of America First. Yeah. He always stressed one of the core tenets is no forever wars. This strike flew right in the face of that.
Did he stick to that?
Initially, the dissonance was clear. Though later, perhaps pragmatically, he did predict the MAGA movement will back Trump. But the friction was there.
And Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Prominent Trump ally, very America First. She opposed the strikes, explicitly sided with Tucker Carlson on this.
What did she say?
She said, foreign wars intervention regime change put America last, kill innocent people, are making us broke, and will ultimately lead to our destruction.
Wow. Direct echo of that isolationist wing.
Absolutely. And Tucker Carlson himself.
Yeah.
He'd blasted those advising Trump to launch strikes against Iran as warmongers just beforehand.
But then he changed his tune.
According to Trump, Carlson later called and apologized, which just shows the intense pressure, maybe the shifting loyalties within that camp.
So real internal friction.
Yeah.
Challenging the America First foreign policy idea.
Definitely shows that even in a loyal base, core principles can get tested by actions.
But it wasn't all opposition from MAGA, right? Some supported it.
No, definitely not all opposition. The internal debate was clear. You had staunch supporters who commended the strikes.
Like who?
Senator John Fetterman, for example. He cheered it as the correct move, said Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and cannot have nuclear capabilities.
Okay. And Lindsey Graham, always a hawk.
Senator Graham, yes. Longtime hawk, close Trump ally, he commended it too. Good. This was the right call. The regime deserves it. Well done.
Did he leave it there?
No. Graham went further. Called for Trump to go all in. back Israel, destroy Iran's nuclear program, give them bunker busters, fly with them.
Wow. So completely different view within the same broad political alignment.
Exactly. It shows that complex mix. Anti-interventionism versus national security concerns versus regional alliances. It divides even those usually aligned.
What are the implications of this division? And for Trump's whole peace through strength idea?
Well, it's being tested as never before, that slogan. This decision undeniably puts him, as analyst Richard Gowan said, back in the war business.
Especially after failing to end the wars in Ukraine and Gaza as promised.
Right. Gowan commented that Trump's peacemaker spiel always looked more like a campaign phrase than a strategy.
Ouch.
It suggests this Iran action might have exposed a gap between the rhetoric his base liked and the reality of his decisions. Could create a lasting split.
And it raises that question. Can you get peace through strength with unilateral strikes? Or does it need more diplomacy?
That's the core question this action forces onto the table. Okay, so the strikes happen. What's next? Iran's military is described as seriously weakened and degraded.
Decades of sanctions, plus the strikes themselves.
But analysts say they still have all sorts of asymmetric ways that they can respond.
Yes. Not necessarily conventional war, but other dangerous options.
Like what? What are the main possibilities?
Well, one big one is potentially closing the Strait of Hormuz.
The oil choke point.
Critically important. Over a fifth of the world's oil supply, 20 million barrels a day, plus tons of natural gas, goes through there.
Has Iran threatened that before?
Hardline politicians there have called for it in crises. Doing it would definitely impose a direct cost on Trump. Trigger an oil price spike, almost immediate inflation effect in the U.S., globally. Bad news before an election.
But it would hurt Iran too, right?
Massively. It'd be an act of dramatic economic self-harm. Their own oil exports rely on the strait. Plus, it risks pulling in the Gulf Arab states.
Who also depend on the strait. Totally. They might be critical of Israel, but they need that waterway open. So closing it is a really high-stakes gamble for everyone.
Okay, that's a huge one. What else? What are the other asymmetric options?
Well, there's the threat of proxy attacks.
Groups they support in the region.
Exactly.
Right.
Like the Houthi forces in Yemen. They've already hit shipping in the Red Sea. They warned their truce with the U.S. would be broken. They'd target U.S. ships again.
And the U.S. response would be?
Likely devastating, according to reports. It would definitely expand the conflict.
Okay, what else? Direct attacks.
That's another option. Direct targets, attacking U.S. bases, allies in the Middle East, stepping up missile attacks on Israel.
Could they target Americans?
Potentially. Targeting U.S. citizens, military members in the region. An Iranian state TV commentator actually declared that. It's a direct threat.
Scary prospect. Any other ways they might respond?
There's the possibility of a delayed response.
Playing the long game.
Exactly. Iran could choose to serve its revenge cold. Patience. Wait for an opportunity. The foreign minister hinted at this.
What did he say?
Saida Abbas Araghchi said Trump's decision will have everlasting consequences. That ambiguity creates long-term tension, uncertainty, keeps everyone guessing.
Amidst all these risks, does this strike actually solve the nuclear problem? Does it stop proliferation long term?
That's the critical question. And analysts seem skeptical. They suggest, yes, strikes will set Iran's program back temporarily, destroy facilities, materials. But it comes at the cost of strengthening Tehran's resolve to reconstitute its sensitive nuclear activities.
So it could make them more determined to get a bomb.
That's the risk. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization already said it wouldn't let development of its national industry be stopped. So maybe a temporary setback, not a final solution, could even accelerate their desire for weapons.
In this situation, it raises that old fear of mission creep, doesn't it? Calls for regime change if Iran hits back.
Absolutely. That perennial risk. Laura Blumenfeld, a seasoned analyst, had that stark warning.
What?
Beware mission creep, aiming for regime change and democratization campaigns. You'll find the bones of many failed U.S. moral missions buried in Middle East sands.
A powerful reminder of past failures.
Highlights the danger of limited strikes turning into open-ended, nation-building disasters. And what's fascinating here is how Sachs's specific critiques fit right in.
How so?
He specifically highlights his view that Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu wants the United States to go to war with Iran, which would be absolutely mindless and destructive.
Sachs directly blames Netanyahu for wanting a wider war.
That's his stated view. He goes further, calling Israel's policy in the region a disgrace, and their actions in Gaza genocidal crimes.
Wow.
Actions he finds abhorrent, especially because Trump has basically given a green light to them, in Sachs's opinion.
So he connects the Iran strike directly to that broader and, in his view, disastrous regional strategy.
Precisely. He sees it as morally indefensible and strategically terrible for the U.S.
Connecting the dots: economics, geopolitics, and a crumbling order.
Okay, so what does this all mean when we put it together? We've got Sachs's really sharp critique of Trump's economics, childish, dangerous, huge global costs.
Right.
Then the Iran strikes, the constitutional questions, the Magyar split, the geopolitical risks. Let's connect those dots now. It seems like the way the tariffs were done, unilateral, emergency powers, one-person rule.
Yeah.
It mirrors the way the Iran strike was done. Unilateral, without full congressional approval. Raises the exact same concerns about the Constitution, about stability.
That is precisely the connection Sachs draws. A clear line from domestic economic policy to foreign policy action.
Oh, so explain that link.
Trump's America First strategy. You see it so clearly in the protectionist trade stuff, right?
Yeah.
Sachs argues that same philosophy just extends into foreign policy. This isolationist approach, he thinks, isn't just isolating the U.S. economy, hurting growth and competitiveness. It's also actively contributing to this global shift away from U.S. dominance.
And the Iran strike fits into that, even though Trump talked about being a peacemaker.
Right. Despite the peacemaker talk, the strike tests that peace through strength idea very hard. Instead of fixing things, it opens a new military front, creates more instability, the exact thing Sachs warns about.
So it's the same underlying philosophy. Unilateral action, minimal cooperation, win-lose thinking.
That seems to be Sachs's argument, just applied in different areas: trade, military action, diplomacy.
What does all this do to global trust? The view of Washington as a reliable partner.
Well, Sachs says it directly. The world should realize that the United States is just one of many countries.
Not indispensable, not the hegemon.
Not the indispensable country, not the world hegemon. And this pattern, unilateral trade actions, unilateral military strikes, bypassing international norms and institutions, it must erode that perception of the U.S. as a reliable, multilateral partner.
It has to.
It fundamentally changes America's standing, its leadership role. Sachs sees this in a huge historical context.
Also,
He views the current instability as the end of a very long cycle that dates back to 1492.
1492.
He means the end of the European-led world. Western colonialism, Western dominance, and specifically U.S. domination after 1945.
So not just a policy change, but a historic shift in global power.
An epochal change. The West is no longer the only center of gravity.
That sounds kind of negative or anxious from a Western perspective.
It often is framed that way here, but what's intriguing is Sachs emphasizes a surprising optimism about this rebalancing.
Optimism from where?
He notes that the voices of other parts of the world are really important and growing. Asia, Africa, Latin America.
Okay.
So while there's a lot more anxiety in the West, especially the U.S., because, as he puts it, nobody likes to be pushed off the perch, he sees a tremendous amount of optimism in places like China, India, across Africa. From their viewpoint, he believes the world is changing in the right direction, towards more equality, more multipolarity.
That's a really different perspective than you usually hear.
It is, and fascinatingly, Sachs points to what he calls positive geopolitical shifts happening.
Positive shift.
That he attributes, ironically, partly to the U.S.'s own strangeness of behavior, its retreat from multilateralism.
How does that work? U.S. strangeness leads to positive shifts.
Well, look at China and India. Historically, rivals, border clashes even.
Right.
Now, partly in response to U.S. policies maybe, they're actively improving trade and investment ties.
Interesting. What else?
China, South Korea, Japan, often divided by U.S. alliances, history. Now, reportedly improving relations, more regional economic integration. And maybe the most striking example, Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Huge rivals. Sectarian political divide, often fueled by U.S. policy.
Exactly. They achieved a rapprochement, a diplomatic breakthrough, brokered by China.
China brokered that.
Yes. And Sachs pointedly noted the U.S. would never have done it and never even have thought about it.
So the implication is
that U.S. unilateralism, instead of cementing U.S. power, is actually pushing other countries to form new independent alliances and diplomatic routes, creating a more diverse, less U.S.-centric world.
it's like the world is adapting, finding its own balance as the U.S. steps back or acts alone.
That seems to be Sachs's interpretation, which leads him to call for more diplomacy among the big powers.
U.S., Russia, China, India.
Yes. He stresses they need to take care not to go into conflict with each other. It sounds like a plea for mutual respect de-escalation.
Especially given the stakes.
Exactly. He emphasizes the existential threat from nuclear superpowers. His core message is the absolute need for some respect among the major powers for each other, that they are not getting into open conflict.
It's not just preferred, it's necessary for survival.
Absolutely. He argues the world can't afford a return to great power conflict that risks nuclear war. Collaboration, understanding are paramount, especially in this emerging multipolar world.
Despite painting a pretty grim picture of current U.S. policy sometimes,
Yeah.
Sachs still ends up sounding cautiously optimistic overall. He says something like, if we don't blow things up, then things are going to be okay.
Right. He believes solutions do exist for the big challenges: food, sustainable energy, healthcare. He stresses there's no fundamental shortfall of resources or know-how.
So we have the tools, the knowledge.
That's his point. The belief in humanity's capacity is there, if we choose the right path.
But he does identify some real shortages, doesn't he?
He does, and they aren't material or intellectual. He talks about a fairness shortage, a niceness shortage, and a calmness shortage.
Fairness, niceness, calmness, those are the deficits.
Those, he argues, are the underlying problems in human behavior, in political leadership. They worsen the geopolitical crises, the climate instability. They stop us from using the solutions we already have.
So global problems are less technical, more moral, behavioral.
That's how he frames it. Needing better governance, a shift in mindset, more than just new inventions.
And even with the U.S. turning protectionist, Sachs still pushes for open trade.
Strongly advocates for an open multilateral system. He even supports China's Belt and Road Initiative, calls it a very big and positive thing.
Really? Despite the criticisms you sometimes hear about BRI.
He sees it as bringing technology, trade, jobs, finance all together to expand the world economy, crucial for global development.
Does he have caveats?
He does offer advice, suggests China make loans longer term for poorer countries, focusing on sustainable development, debt sustainability, and not just short-term gain.
And finally, he circles back to Ukraine.
Yes, reiterates his view of the war as a disastrous mistake.
Why disastrous?
Partly, he attributes it to the U.S. not knowing how to make peace and blowing the chance for real collective security after 1991.
How did the U.S. blow that chance, in his view?
By expanding NATO right up to Russia's borders instead of building a truly inclusive security system that involved Russia.
So again, favoring unilateral or bloc expansion over broader diplomacy.
Exactly. It powerfully reinforces his whole argument. Diplomacy over military action, multilateralism over unilateralism, tying his economic, military, and foreign policy critiques together into this vision for a more stable, cooperative future. Yeah. He sees the roots of current conflicts in that failure to build genuine collective security back then.
Wow. What a deep dive that was.
Yeah.
We've really unpacked how Jeffrey Sachs sees current U.S. policy under Trump. Childish and dangerous economics, constitutional overreach on Iran, a fundamental misreading of these huge global power shifts.
Yeah, and we've seen the consequences he points to, that $10 trillion global wealth loss estimate, the geopolitical risks from unilateral actions, the splits even within political movements here. Trump's peace through strength idea is definitely being tested, and the world, as Sachs sees it, is clearly realigning, finding new paths away from U.S. unilateralism.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners. If we really consider Sachs's vision, a world not just revolving around the U.S. anymore, but becoming, as he says, more interesting, diverse, and interconnected, how might you rethink the role of global cooperation, of critical thinking, especially when navigating this increasingly unstable world, where leaders make decisions impacting not just economies, but potentially international peace itself?
Maybe the biggest challenge isn't resources or know-how, like Sachs says,
but that shortage of fairness, niceness, and calmness. Something to think about. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.